Odette Slater was hired to take care of a millionaire who had been in a coma for years, but what she discovered was terrifying. The moment she stepped into the Whitmore mansion, she felt something was off. The heavy air, the drawn curtains, and the oppressive silence made the place feel more like a mausoleum than a home. Odette desperately needed the job, but deep down, something told her she should have turned it down. On her first day, while adjusting Ambrose Whitmore's pillows, she noticed something strange. His fingers, they moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but she was certain of what she saw. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled slightly, but Odette kept her composure and called for the family's personal assistant, Alistair Boone. He walked into the room with steady steps, his expression unreadable, as if he already knew what was coming. "You must be tired, nurse," he said with a dry smile. "These things happen." Odette knew she wasn't imagining it. After years of working with critical patients, she had never seen anything like it. Ambrose wasn't as unconscious as they wanted her to believe. But why hide it? In the following days, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Odette began to notice small inconsistencies. Medications that weren't listed in the official prescriptions, subtle changes in the patient's routine, and, most unsettling of all, the mansion transformed into a gloomy place after nightfall. All the staff disappeared precisely at 9 o'clock. The doors were locked, and an eerie silence filled the corridors. "Never leave your room after 9, Alistair warned sternly, more as a command than advice. Odette tried to brush it off, but the rule haunted her every night. What could possibly be happening there? That night, unable to sleep, she decided she had to find out. With cautious steps, she opened her bedroom door and walked down the dark hallways of the mansion. Every creak of the wooden floor echoed in her ears, but she pressed on. When she reached Ambrose's door, she heard a muffled whisper. Holding her breath, she peeked through the crack. What she saw made her blood run cold. Alistair was standing next to the millionaire, leaning over him, whispering something into his ear. Odette felt her throat go dry. Suddenly, Ambrose's eyes opened slowly. They were filled with something Odette couldn't quite decipher. Fear? Dread? He was conscious. She instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. They were hiding something. Something far bigger than she could have imagined. Odette realized, too late, that she had gotten herself into something dangerous, and getting out wouldn't be as easy as she had thought. Odette closed the bedroom door with trembling hands and tried to catch her breath. Her heart was pounding, and the image of Ambrose's open eyes was still burned into her mind. Something inside her screamed that she needed to leave that house, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. She hurried back to her room, turned off the lights, and sat on the edge of the bed. The mansion's silence was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were listening. Odette tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the fear she had been feeling since the first day there. But deep down, she knew the truth. Ambrose was conscious, and someone wanted to keep it a secret. The night dragged on. Odette couldn't sleep. She lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle sounds of the house. Creaking wood, the wind rattling against the windows, distant footsteps that seemed to come from the hallway. Each sound sent her mind spiraling into scenarios she didn't want to imagine. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, she got up, determined. She needed to proceed with caution. That morning, when she went down to the kitchen, she found Agnes Harlow, the housekeeper, quietly preparing breakfast. Odette tried to make small talk, something light to hide her unease. "Did you sleep well, Agnes?" The woman, without looking up from the tray she was arranging, replied indifferently, "Well enough." Odette noticed that every conversation in this house was always superficial, as if no one wanted to say more than necessary. As she sipped her coffee, Odette observed the other staff members. None of them made eye contact. They moved around the kitchen like ghosts, doing what was expected of them without question. Then Alistair walked in. He looked directly at Odette, and for a brief moment, she had the distinct feeling that he knew what had happened the night before. "I hope you're settling in well, nurse," he said, his smile almost too polite. Odette forced a smile in return and replied, "Yes, of course. Everything is as expected." But inside, she knew nothing about this place was normal. Later, When she returned to Ambrose's room, she found the window slightly open. She was sure she had closed it the night before. Moving cautiously, she looked outside, seeing the mansion's vast garden shrouded in a thin mist over the ancient trees. Odette shut the window firmly this time and turned her gaze to the man in the bed. He seemed motionless, but now she knew that was just an illusion. As she checked the medical equipment, something caught her attention. A bottle of medication was out of place. She picked it up and read the label. It was a sedative, one of the most potent she had ever come across in her career. It wasn't listed in the prescription she had been given on her first day. Her fingers tightened around the bottle. Someone was keeping Ambrose in this state. Odette knew she was getting herself into something dangerous, but there was no turning back now. She had to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Odette held the bottle of sedative in her hands, feeling a chill run down her spine. None of it made sense. If Ambrose Whitmore had been in a coma for years, why would anyone be administering such a high dose of sedation? She looked at the motionless man in the bed and wondered how long he had been trying to wake up. The feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew stronger, and Odette knew she had to proceed carefully. She slipped the bottle into the pocket of her apron and continued her routine as if nothing had happened. As she changed the bedsheets, she noticed a faint mark on Ambrose's wrist. It was an old, thin scar, almost imperceptible, but it indicated that he had undergone some kind of surgical procedure. Odette touched the patient's cold skin, feeling an unexpected sadness welling up inside her. Ambrose wasn't just a millionaire in a coma. He was a man trapped inside his own body, surrounded by secrets no one was willing to reveal. Once she finished tending to him, she stepped back and took a deep breath. She was about to leave the room when she noticed something unusual. The bedside table, which had always been immaculate, now had a slightly open drawer. Her heart pounded as she carefully pulled it open. Inside, there was a yellowed envelope addressed to someone named Eleanor Whitmore. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Odette glanced around, feeling guilty for snooping, but her curiosity won out. She opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter, penned in an elegant and steady handwriting. "Eleanor, my love, forgive me for what I did. I know there are no excuses, but everything I did was for you. What they said isn't true. One day, I hope you can forgive me." Odette read the words over and over again. The letter wasn't signed, but the pain in the words was undeniable. Who was Eleanor? What had she discovered? And why had the letter remained there all these years? A pang of empathy hit her. She knew all too well what it was like to live surrounded by secrets, to wait for answers that might never come. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Alistair Boone entered without warning. Odette quickly stuffed the letter into her apron pocket, trying to appear composed. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning every detail as if inspecting for any disturbance. "Everything in order, nurse?" he asked, with that same polite smile that carried an undertone of something darker. Odette forced a calm expression. "Yes, Mr. Boone. Just finishing up my routine." He studied her for a moment, too long, before finally saying, "Good. Mr. Whitmore needs his rest. And remember, no unnecessary curiosity." Odette's stomach churned, but she maintained her composure. She waited for him to leave the room before closing the door behind him, pressing the letter tightly in her pocket. She knew she had found something important, something that could put her in danger. Back in her room, she sat on the bed and reread the letter under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The name Eleanor Whitmore echoed in her mind. She grabbed her phone and did a quick search. Her heart pounded as an old newspaper article appeared. Eleanor Whitmore, Ambrose's wife, had gone missing over 20 years ago and was never found. Odette dropped the phone onto the bed, a cold dread washing over her. If Eleanor had disappeared, then who was the letter meant for? Odette read and reread the article about Eleanor Whitmore. The black and white photo showed a woman with a serene expression, a faint smile that concealed something deeper. The headline stated that Eleanor had disappeared more than 20 years ago without a trace. No leads, no witnesses. She had simply vanished. Odette glanced at the crumpled letter in her hands and felt a tightness in her chest. If Eleanor had been missing for so long, who had left that letter in Ambrose's room? And why was it still there, as if it had been waiting to be found? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise outside. Odette quickly turned off her phone screen and sat still. Slow footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the soft creak of wood. Someone was standing right outside her door. She held her breath, feeling her heart pound in her chest. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the footsteps. After a few tense seconds, the shadow behind the door disappeared. Odette knew she had to be more careful. She tucked the letter inside one of the books on the shelf, grabbed a sheet of paper, and began jotting down everything she had discovered so far. This was how she always handled difficult moments, by organizing her thoughts. The search for answers wasn't just about Ambrose or Eleanor anymore. Somehow, Odette felt she needed to uncover the truth for herself, as if this was bigger than just a job. The next morning, when she entered Ambrose's room, she immediately noticed that someone had been there before her. The curtains were drawn open, allowing the sunlight to illuminate the man's still face. The tray of medications had been rearranged, and the bottle of sedative she had hidden the day before was now back in its original spot. A shiver ran down Odette's spine. Who else was watching her? As she changed the sheets, a voice spoke behind her. "It's not your job to ask questions, nurse." Odette turned slowly and found Harrison Whitmore, Ambrose's eldest son, standing in the doorway. He had a commanding presence, a cold stare, and a slight smirk at the corner of his mouth, as if he already knew she was suspicious. "My job is to take care of your father to the best of my ability," she replied, keeping her composure. Harrison stepped into the room uninvited, his gaze sweeping over Ambrose as if he were nothing more than a fixture in the room. "My father needs rest, and I need you to stop meddling in things that don't concern you." Odette folded her arms, standing her ground. "I'm just following the medical recommendations." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't worry about the medications. Some things are better left as they are." Odette watched him leave, feeling the tension lingering in the air. He knew she had found something, and, even worse, he wanted her to know that she was being watched. Later, while helping Agnes in the kitchen, Odette decided to fish for some information. The Whitmore family. Have they always been like this? The housekeeper didn't look up from the pot she was stirring, but her expression hardened. The Whitmore family has always been complicated. Complicated how? Odette pressed. Agnes sighed and finally met her gaze. "Some secrets are better left forgotten, dear. But if I were you, I wouldn't get involved in things that don't concern me." A chill ran down Odette's spine. It was becoming increasingly clear that Eleanor hadn't simply disappeared. Later in the hallway, Odette spotted Alistair speaking quietly with Harrison. They were talking in hushed tones, but the serious expressions on both of their faces said it all. Something was being kept hidden, something Odette was starting to uncover. What if Eleanor had never left the house? She would need all the courage she could muster to find out. Odette spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. The letter, the bottle of sedatives, the suspicious glances, everything pointed to something being very wrong in that house. As she walked through the silent hallways of the mansion, she felt the invisible presence of secrets lurking behind every closed door. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. That night, lying in bed, Odette tried to push away the thoughts that kept her awake. She tossed and turned, but every sound in the house made her hold her breath. The wind howling against the windows, the creaking of the old wooden floors, the distant footsteps in the hallway. Suddenly, something different caught her attention. A soft noise, like someone fumbling with the lock on her door. She sat up, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought it was just her imagination, but then she heard it again. Someone was outside. Holding her breath, she stayed perfectly still. The sound stopped abruptly. Odette remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, then gathered the courage to get up and slowly turn the doorknob. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. But there was something on the floor, a small silver key, glinting under the dim light. Odette carefully picked up the key and shut the door quickly. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she examined it closely. It wasn't an ordinary key. It looked old, with finely crafted details. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was it a warning or a clue? The next morning, During breakfast, Odette quietly observed the table as Agnes served tea. The atmosphere in the house felt heavier than usual. Harrison sat silently, reading the newspaper, while Alistair fiddled absent-mindedly with his pocket watch. Odette needed to find out more, to test whether the key meant something. "Agnes," she said, trying to sound casual, "is there any part of the house that's been locked up for a long time?" The housekeeper paused for a second, but quickly resumed arranging the tray. "This house is full of locked doors, dear. Some are better left unopened." Odette noticed the tension in her response, but kept her composure. "I bet there are some amazing rooms here. There must be plenty of places that no one uses anymore." Agnes glanced briefly at Alistair, who remained silent but was clearly listening. "You'd best focus on your work, sweetheart." After breakfast, Odette went up to Ambrose's room, gripping the key tightly in her apron pocket. She looked around, making sure no one was watching, and made her way to a door beside the library, one of the few she had never opened. She inserted the key and turned it slowly, feeling the lock give with a soft click. Behind the door, she found a small, dusty room filled with old boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. In the back, a dark wooden desk caught her attention. Odette stepped closer, and what she saw made her stomach churn. On the desk lay another letter addressed to Eleanor. The ink was slightly faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably the same as the previous letter. "Eleanor, I tried to protect you, but I don't know how much longer I can keep everything hidden. You need to leave while there's still time." Odette felt a lump in her throat. Eleanor had tried to escape, but something, or someone, had stopped her. She was about to take the letter when she heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, she switched off the flashlight on her phone and remained still. The door creaked slightly, and Odette held her breath. A shadow stretched across the light from the hallway. It lingered for what felt like an eternity before the footsteps finally faded away. When she was sure she was alone, she slipped the letter into her pocket and hurried out of the room. Odette now knew she was entangled in something far bigger than she had imagined. The only question left was, how far was she willing to go? Odette returned to her room, clutching the letter tightly in her hands. Her mind revolved around a single question. What really happened to Eleanor Whitmore? With every new discovery, the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth mixed with the growing fear of being caught. She sat on the bed and unfolded the paper once more. The shaky, hurried handwriting made it clear. Eleanor had been running from something or someone. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her life had never been easy, but nothing had prepared her for something like this. In some way, she saw herself reflected in those words. Just like Eleanor, Odette knew what it was like to live in fear, to feel trapped in a situation with no way out. Maybe that's why she couldn't simply walk away. The clock in the hallway chimed 9 o'clock. She looked at the door, remembering Alistair's strict rule. Never leave your room after 9. But Odette wasn't one to follow rules blindly. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the dark hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, each careful step echoing in the silence of the house. She passed the library, the dining hall, and finally reached the grand staircase leading downstairs. Something inside her whispered that Eleanor had never left this house. As she approached Ambrose's study, muffled voices caught her attention. She stopped beside the slightly open door, straining to hear every word. "You need to keep control, Alistair." Harrison's voice was low, laced with impatience. "If she keeps digging where she shouldn't, we'll have a problem." Odette swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat run down her neck. "Everything is under control," Alistair replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She doesn't know anything." Odette took a cautious step back, afraid they might sense her presence. But as she retreated, her hip brushed against a small table in the hallway. The soft thud it made was barely audible, but it was enough to freeze her in place. The voices inside the study fell silent instantly. She turned and hurried back to her room, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Closing the door behind her, her hands trembled. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. She needed answers, but now, she also needed to be careful. The next morning, as she entered Ambrose's room for another day of care, she noticed something different. His eyes were slightly open. For the first time, He seemed present. Odette approached hesitantly. "Mr. Whitmore, can you hear me?" she whispered. For a moment, she thought she saw his lips move slightly. Her heart pounded. She gently took his hand, feeling his cold skin. His breathing grew heavier, as if he was struggling to break free from his state. Then, with visible effort, he gave her fingers the faintest squeeze. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to paralyze her. Ambrose Whitmore was trying to communicate. Odette stayed there for a long time, waiting for another sign. But the man soon returned to his usual stillness, as if that fleeting moment had never happened. Yet, she knew she wasn't imagining it. Something was happening to him. As she left the room, she found Agnes standing in the hallway with a grave expression. The housekeeper looked at Odette as if she already knew what had just happened. "He's waking up, isn't he?" Agnes asked in a hushed voice, avoiding direct eye contact. Odette hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think so." "What does that mean?" Agnes sighed, glancing around before whispering. "It means time is running out. For all of us." Odette stood frozen in the hallway, Agnes's words echoing in her mind. Time is running out. What did that mean? For Ambrose? For her? For everyone in that house? She looked at the housekeeper, searching for answers. But Agnes avoided her gaze and quickly disappeared down the stairs. Taking a deep breath, Odette returned to her room. She closed the door carefully, retrieved the hidden letter from the shelf, and read it once more. The words felt heavier now that she knew Ambrose was, in some way, conscious. "Eleanor, I tried to protect you, but I don't know how much longer I can keep everything hidden. You need to leave while you still can." If Eleanor needed to leave, why was she never found? What had stopped her from escaping? Odette was certain the answer was somewhere within the walls of that mansion. That night, the silence of the house felt even heavier. Lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her thoughts fixated on the same question. What was being hidden here? Then she heard it again. The same footsteps pacing outside her room, slow and deliberate. But this time, something was different. A faint metallic sound, as if someone was trying to unlock something, or perhaps place something inside the lock. Odette sat up slowly, her eyes fixed on the door. She remained still for a moment before gathering the courage to stand, take a deep breath, and swiftly turn the knob. The hallway was empty, but something was there. A small envelope lay on the floor. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, stepped back inside, and locked the door. She opened the envelope and found a single short phrase hastily written. "Be careful who you trust." A chill ran down her spine. Who could have left this? She was about to hide the note when a soft knock on the door made her jump. "Odette, it's me." Agnes's urgent voice came from the other side. Odette opened the door cautiously, finding the housekeeper with a worried expression. Agnes slipped inside quickly, shutting the door behind her. "You need to leave this house, girl. You're going too far," she whispered, her eyes darting around as if someone might be listening. Odette held the note tightly between her fingers. "Who left this?" she asked, showing it to Agnes. The older woman scanned the message and let out a deep sigh, running a hand through her graying hair. "I don't know, but I know what it means. There are people in this house who don't want the truth coming out." Odette studied Agnes's face, searching for any sign of honesty. "And you? What are you hiding?" Agnes looked away, but her voice was laced with emotion. "I was young when I started working here. I saw things that should have never happened. I saw Eleanor try to escape, and I saw when she was stopped." Odette's throat tightened. "What happened to her, Agnes?" The housekeeper took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "She never left this house, Odette. She never made it out." Odette closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. So Eleanor was still here, somewhere under this very roof, hidden where no one dared to look. Agnes grasped her hand firmly. "You need to be careful. If Harrison or Alistair suspect you know too much, they'll find a way to silence you." Odette knew she had come too far to back down now. She needed to uncover the truth, but more than ever, she had to tread carefully. As soon as Agnes left the room, Odette pulled out the small key she had found days earlier. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. If Eleanor was still in the mansion, in any form, She had to find out where. She slipped on a light coat and quietly stepped into the dark hallway. Every step took her closer to the truth, or to danger. Odette descended the stairs cautiously, feeling the midnight chill seep into her skin. The mansion was cloaked in a dense darkness, pierced only by the faint moonlight filtering through the heavy curtains. The key in her pocket felt heavier with every step, as if it carried the weight of all the house's secrets. Her destination was the old music room, a space rarely used but once Eleanor's favorite, according to Agnes. Odette knew she had to move quickly. If Harrison or Alistair discovered her investigation, they wouldn't hesitate to get rid of her. The door to the music room was stuck, as if it hadn't been opened in years. She turned the key gently, and a soft click echoed through the silence. Odette pushed the door open slowly, a cloud of dust rising into the air, making her cover her mouth. The room was vast, filled with antique furniture draped in white sheets. At the center stood a grand piano, its keys exposed, covered in dust, as if waiting for someone to play them again. Her eyes scanned the room until something caught her attention. At the far end of the wall hung a portrait of Eleanor. Time had faded the image, but the sadness in her eyes remained. Odette stepped closer, running her fingers along the frame, and felt a slight unevenness in the wood. She hesitated for a moment before pressing it gently. A soft click echoed, and right before her eyes, the wall slid a few inches, revealing a hidden opening. Her heart pounded. Behind the panel, she found a small hidden room. The space was cramped, with a narrow bed and shelves stacked with dusty notebooks. In the center sat a worn leather armchair, as if someone had spent countless hours sitting there. Odette swallowed hard. Had Eleanor been kept here? She grabbed one of the notebooks and flipped to the first page. The elegant handwriting belonged to Eleanor. They tell me it's for my own safety, but I know it's not. Ambrose knows nothing, and I fear that if he ever finds out, it will be too late. Odette flipped through the pages quickly, each line revealing a piece of the story that had been buried for so long. I tried to escape tonight, but Alistair found me before I reached the gates. He said everything would be fine, that Harrison would take care of it. But I know I'm trapped. A lump formed in Odette's throat. Eleanor never left this house. Perhaps she never had a real chance to escape. A noise in the hallway made Odette snap the notebook shut. She froze, waiting. Someone was outside. The shadows beneath the door indicated that whoever it was stood there, listening. Time seemed to freeze as Odette held her breath. After a few long moments, the footsteps retreated slowly. She waited a little longer before slipping out of the hidden room and carefully closing the panel behind her. Back in her room, she tucked the notebook under her blouse, feeling closer to the truth than ever before. But at the same time, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. Before trying to sleep, she opened the notebook again, rereading Eleanor's words. She had to find out what really happened before it was too late. Odette spent the next morning in a constant state of alert. Every approaching footstep made her heart race, fearing that someone had discovered what she had found the night before. Eleanor's journal was hidden beneath the loose floorboards in her wardrobe, but the lingering sense of danger wouldn't leave her mind. As she changed Ambrose's sheets, she noticed his eyes were slightly more open than usual. His gaze seemed lost in some distant point, but there was something different. Odette leaned in and spoke softly. "Mr. Whitmore, I know you can hear me." His fingers twitched slightly. It was a subtle gesture, but enough to fill Odette with hope. He was trying to react, trying to reconnect with the world around him. She gently took his hand, watching his expression closely. A faint shadow of emotion flickered across his face, as if he was struggling to break free from his condition. "They hid everything from you, didn't they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, his breathing changed, becoming faster. Then, as if the effort was too much, his eyes slowly closed again. Before she could process what had just happened, the door swung open abruptly and Alistair stepped in. His eyes swept across the room, scrutinizing every detail, as if he sensed something was amiss. "How is he today?" he asked, his tone firm. Odette straightened up, trying to maintain her composure. "The same as always. No changes." Alistair remained silent for a moment, his gaze lingering on her before he forced a tight smile. "Good. Keep it that way, nurse. No. Unnecessary curiosity. He left without another word, but Odette knew that warning was no coincidence. They were watching her every move. Later, while Agnes was preparing tea in the kitchen, Odette approached and spoke in a low voice. I need to show you something. The housekeeper glanced around, ensuring they were alone, then followed her to a secluded corner of the pantry. Odette pulled Eleanor's journal from her apron and handed it to Agnes. The older woman flipped through the pages with trembling hands, her eyes widening at each line she read. When she finished, she closed the journal slowly and looked at Odette with a mix of fear and sorrow. You shouldn't have found this, girl. This won't end well. Agnes, Eleanor never left this house, did she? Odette's voice was filled with urgency. The housekeeper sighed, as if carrying a burden too heavy for too long. No, she never left. Odette's stomach churned. The truth was right there in front of her, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, determined to see things through, Odette returned to the music room. The key trembled between her fingers, but she knew she had to keep going. As soon as she stepped into the dark room, a sharp sound echoed behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding. Harrison stood in the doorway, his cold eyes filled with suspicion. Looking for something, nurse? Odette swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. I just wanted to take a look around the house, Mr. Whitmore. It has such an old beauty, doesn't it? He stepped closer, the shadow of a smile playing on his lips. Some old beauties are better left forgotten. Odette gripped the key tightly in her pocket, trying to mask her unease. You're right. I think I've seen enough for tonight. She walked past him slowly, feeling his gaze piercing her back until she disappeared down the corridor. Once inside her room, she locked the door and took a deep breath. The Whitmore mansion held secrets that many preferred to keep buried, but Odette knew she couldn't leave without uncovering the whole truth. Odette returned to the music room that night, feeling her anxiety grow with every step. The house was engulfed in an oppressive silence, as if it knew that something was about to be uncovered. The small key she had found some time ago felt heavier in her pocket, a constant reminder that there was no turning back now. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open and slipped inside, carefully closing it behind her. The room was shrouded in shadows, and the scent of aged wood mixed with dust filled the air. The grand piano at the center, covered in a fine layer of dust, stood as a silent witness to time. Odette approached the desk at the back of the room, the same place where she had found Eleanor's letter days ago. Taking one last glance at the door, she pulled the key from her pocket and carefully inserted it into the lock of the bottom drawer. The key turned smoothly, and a soft click echoed through the room. Swallowing hard, she slowly pulled the drawer open. Inside, she found a small wooden box with the initials EW precisely carved into the lid. Odette picked it up carefully and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a bundle of old letters, a few photographs, and a delicate gold pendant wrapped in a piece of cloth. Her fingers slid over the letters, feeling the rough texture of the aged paper. She unfolded the first letter and began to read. Ambrose, my love, I don't know how much longer I can stay here. They are watching me, and I know they want to silence me. If anything happens to me, please don't believe anything they say. Know that I have always loved you. A lump formed in Odette's throat. Eleanor hadn't simply disappeared. She had feared for her life. Flipping through the other letters, Odette found a troubling mention of Alistair. Eleanor described how he had become increasingly controlling, insisting that she remain in the mansion against her will. Alistair says everything they do is to protect the family, but I know the truth. Harrison is afraid of what I might reveal, and now they want to erase me for good. Odette examined the photo that accompanied the letters. In it, Eleanor stood beside Ambrose, wearing a restrained smile, but her eyes told a different story. Fear? Resignation? The reality was far darker than Odette had imagined. Ambrose wasn't in a coma because of age or illness. He had been silenced. Before she could fully process it all, a sound echoed from the hallway. She froze, quickly switching off her phone's flashlight, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door. For a moment, everything was silent. Odette clutched the box tightly to her chest, praying no one would come inside. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly retreated. She knew she needed to get out of there, but as she closed the drawer, something caught her eye, an envelope hidden at the very back, different from Eleanor's letters. The yellowed paper bore the Whitmore family crest. With shaky hands, Odette opened it and found documents signed by Harrison and Alastair, mentioning a financial transaction labeled as an emergency rehabilitation for Ambrose. A wave of indignation washed over her. They had been keeping Ambrose sedated to ensure he couldn't reveal the truth. Odette knew she had to be cautious. She tucked the box and documents into her coat pocket, quietly leaving the room and making her way down the dark corridor with light but determined steps. This house hid far more than just family secrets. It concealed crimes. Odette closed the door behind her as carefully as possible, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled, and the weight of the truth was beginning to suffocate her. Eleanor had tried to escape, had been caught and silenced. But how? What had Harrison really done to her? And why was Alastair so determined to keep everything buried? She knew she couldn't delay any longer. It was time to confront the Whitmore family. The next morning, while preparing Ambrose's medication, Odette noticed something unusual. His gaze seemed sharper, as if he were fighting to reconnect with the reality around him. Then, with visible effort, he murmured something so faint it almost went unnoticed. "Garden." Odette froze. Her eyes widened, and she leaned in closer. "What did you say, Mr. Whitmore?" she whispered urgently. Ambrose took a ragged breath and repeated, "Garden." "Eleanor." A chill ran down Odette's spine. The garden. That old, abandoned garden behind the mansion. Maybe it held the answers she had been searching for. Before she could react, Harrison entered the room. He watched her closely, as if expecting a reaction. "Is my father improving today?" he asked, his voice dry and calculated. Odette forced a small smile, keeping her tone calm. He had a slight response. It could be a good sign. Harrison tilted his head, studying her every word. "Just focus on your work and don't get distracted by unnecessary things." The veiled threat was clear, but Odette had already made up her mind. Later that afternoon, taking advantage of the house's usual bustle, Odette slipped through the back hallway and reached the side exit leading to the garden. The iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, revealing an overgrown space filled with weeds and statues weathered by time. She walked through the dry shrubs, her eyes scanning for any clue. And then, she saw it. A patch of disturbed earth near the old greenhouse. Her heart pounded as she knelt down and began digging with her hands, pushing aside the damp soil until her fingers hit something solid. It was a small wooden box, covered in moss and mud. With trembling hands, she opened it and found a collection of yellowed papers and a delicate hair ribbon neatly folded inside. The first sheet bore familiar handwriting. Eleanor's. "If anyone finds this, please tell Ambrose the truth. I tried to escape, but they wouldn't let me. I fear something worse may happen to me, and I no longer know who to trust. But if I disappear, know that I fought for the truth out of love." Tears welled in Odette's eyes. It was all there. The proof Ambrose needed, the truth Eleanor never got the chance to deliver. Before she could fully process it, hurried footsteps approached. "Harrison, what do you think you're doing, nurse?" His voice cut through the air like a knife. Odette slowly stood, slipping the papers into her pocket. "Just getting some fresh air," she said, keeping her voice even. He stepped closer, his face dark, his breathing heavy. "You're meddling where you shouldn't. This could be dangerous for you." Odette clenched the box tightly inside her coat and met his gaze. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Whitmore?" He offered a tense smile. "I'm giving you a warning. Curious people don't always end up well." Odette stood her ground, her heart racing but her voice steady. "The truth always finds a way out, Harrison. Sooner or later." He narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. He simply turned and walked back inside the mansion, leaving Odette standing there, trembling but resolute. She knew she was reaching the point of no return, and now there was no turning back. Odette hurried back to the mansion, clutching Eleanor's box tightly against her chest. The cold night wind cut through her skin, but it wasn't the chill that made her tremble. It was the creeping sensation that every shadow around her concealed a pair of eyes watching her every move. She needed to act fast. As soon as she slipped inside the mansion, she moved silently through the corridors, avoiding any unwanted encounters. Climbing the stairs, she reached her room and locked the door behind her. Leaning against the cold wooden surface, she tried to steady her ragged breathing. She placed the box on the bed, carefully opening it and spreading out its contents. Letters, bank records, and documents that exposed suspicious transactions under the Whitmore family name. Harrison and Alastair had been siphoning money for years, using Ambrose's name while he lay helpless. And when Eleanor found out, they made sure she would never speak. Odette closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a crushing weight on her chest. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway snapped her back to reality. Slow, heavy footsteps stopped right outside her door. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. She quickly turned off the lights and held her breath. The doorknob twisted slightly, as if someone was testing if it was locked. Seconds felt like hours. When the footsteps finally retreated, Odette knew she couldn't waste any more time. She gathered the papers and the box and slipped out of her room, making her way through the mansion toward Ambrose's office. Once inside the darkened room, she approached the frail man lying motionless in bed. "Mr. Whitmore, I found it. I found everything," she whispered, holding his cold hand gently. For a moment, his eyes seemed to flicker, and Odette could have sworn she saw a single tear roll down his cheek. "I know you can hear me, and I promise this will end." Before she could say another word, the door burst open. Harrison stood in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" he spat. Odette stood abruptly, clutching the papers against her chest. "I know everything, Harrison. I know what you did to Eleanor. I know what you did to Ambrose. And I won't let it continue." Harrison let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really think you can change anything? People like you." He stepped closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't understand how this world works." Odette took a step back, but her voice remained firm. "People like me know the truth. And now, so will everyone else." Before Harrison could make another move, the door swung open again. Agnes stood there, her expression stern and resolute. "It's over, Harrison. The police are on their way." Harrison froze, and for the first time, Odette saw something new in his eyes: fear. Agnes stepped inside and placed a reassuring hand on Odette's shoulder. "You did the right thing, dear." Odette took a deep breath, letting relief flood her chest. She knew there was still much to resolve, but for the first time, it felt like Eleanor would finally have justice. The echo of sirens pierced the stillness of the night, bringing with it a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Odette watched from the window as the police cars slowly made their way up the long gravel driveway of the mansion. Agnes stood beside her, her face heavy with the weight of years of secrets finally coming to an end. Harrison stood motionless in the center of the room, his shoulders tense, fists clenched tightly. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a way out of what was about to unfold. As the officers entered, he lifted his chin, forcing a confident smile. "This is ridiculous. Do you really think you can incriminate me based on the stories of a nosy nurse?" The officer in charge, a man with sharp features, turned to Odette. "Do you have the evidence, miss?" She took a deep breath and handed over Eleanor's box along with the documents she had found in the garden. Eleanor Whitmore never ran away. She tried, but they silenced her. And Ambrose, he was never sick. They kept him this way to stop him from revealing the truth. The officer flipped through the papers in silence, his expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Harrison Whitmore, you are under arrest for financial fraud and kidnapping." Harrison laughed, but this time, there was a slight tremor in his voice. "You have no idea what you're doing." As the officers handcuffed him, his eyes locked onto Odette's. "You ruined everything." She held his gaze, unwavering. "I did what was right." The officers escorted him out, and the door slammed shut behind them. A heavy silence filled the room, and Odette felt her legs weaken. She sank onto the sofa, running her hands over her face. Agnes stepped closer, and gently took her hand. "Thank you, dear. If it weren't for you." Her voice broke, and she blinked quickly to hold back tears. Odette looked at the housekeeper with warmth. Eleanor deserved to be remembered, and Ambrose deserves to know someone fought for him. The next morning, Odette visited Ambrose's room. He was awake, his eyes slowly wandering across the ceiling, but something in his expression had changed. Somehow, it felt like he knew the nightmare was finally over. She held his hand gently. "It's all right now, Mr. Whitmore. Eleanor will finally have peace." A single tear rolled down his cheek, and his fingers lightly squeezed Odette's hand. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. And for Odette, it was enough. A few days later, with the house quieter than ever, Odette packed her bags. She walked through the halls one last time, feeling the weight of everything she had experienced there. As she stepped out the front door, Agnes walked her to the car. "You'll always have a place here if you ever want to come back." Odette smiled, embracing the older woman warmly. "Thank you, Agnes. But I think it's time to move on." She got into the car and watched as Whitmore Mansion disappeared in the rearview mirror. As she drove away, she felt a sense of lightness in her heart. No matter how many secrets that house still held, the truth that mattered had finally come to light. And that, for her, was enough. What part of the story surprised you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts.